Hi, and welcome to today's Nature Here TV show. Our today's show is a legacy of Hulda Klager, the Lilac Lady. This interview tells the dramatic story of Hulda Klager, who, with a great deal of determination and passion for lilacs, created what is now the Hulda Klager Lilac Gardens. Hulda Klager's career as a hybridizer had many challenges to go along with her great successes. The Lilac Lady biographical interviews take place at Hulda Klager's estate in Woodland, Washington. Hulda Klager Lilac Gardens is located 30 minutes north of Portland at 115 South Perkins Road, Woodland, Washington. Their website, www.lilacgardens.com. The chances are that many of the varieties of lilacs that you have growing in your own garden were the result of the lifetime work of Hulda Klager. Please enjoy the program.
It's wonderful.
I just love all the flowers, and it's really a treat to come out and walk through the gardens while the flowers are in bloom, and you have all the different smells and all the different colors, doubles and triples and the flowerets. I like the color of the lilac, I like the smell of the lilac, and as a child I love the taste of a lilac. Yes. You can pinch off the little flower and suck out the pollens that the bees have put in there. We recently had a program given by a local nursery, and they talked about using lilacs in cooking as well.
What would you do if you were 83 years old and the very thing that you worked for your entire life had been suddenly washed away in a flood? This is what happened to Hulda Klager in 1948. When the flood waters receded, her entire work on lilacs was gone, along with a lot of other flowers that she worked on. The only thing left were some of the larger trees. What would you do about that?
There was a large flood in Woodland in 1948, and Hulda lost almost all her lilacs and all her shrubs. Just the tall trees were able to survive.
The thing that I would admire most about Hulda is her dedication. And after the destructive flood of 1948, that at 83, she had the courage to continue with her propagation and to rebuild her garden.
Hulda Klager was a simple farm housewife that read a book by Luther Burbank when she was ill, and she became fascinated by his work, developing better fruits and vegetables. She, from that, got the idea that maybe she could improve her own apple tree so that she wouldn't have to cut such tiny little apples up to make a pie. And what she did was she crossed two apples that she thought would improve her tree. And she was so successful with this that she became really excited about it and decided to work on other things as well. She loved flowers. She worked on camellias and other flowers, but her favorite flower was the lilac. She remembered it from her childhood back in Wisconsin, and she loved the scent of it. And so she sent for some lilacs to work on from back east. As you can imagine, the Postal Service wasn't what it is today. And when they got here, the lilacs, all but 3 of them, were pretty much damaged. But she took those 3 lilacs and began to grow them. And from those 3 lilacs, she crossed them every which way she could think of. and began to develop new varieties of lilacs. Of course, as she worked, she got better and better, and eventually she became known as the Lilac Lady. Well, in 1948, when the flood hit, Hulda had rows and rows of lilacs. She had become so well known that she had a lilac week every year when people came to see her lilacs, decide which lilacs they liked, purchased them, and then they came back in the fall and she dug the starts up for them so they could take them home and grow them in her garden. At the time of the flood, it was estimated that she probably had some 250 lilac plants. Not all different ones, but 250 plants that represented her life's work with lilacs. The pictures show that she was absolutely devastated by this loss. You add the loss of her life's work to the fact that her only son, who lived here with her, died during the same year. And at 83 years old, you can imagine how devastated she was and probably pretty tired. But she was of strong German stock, and she was determined that she was going to start over again. Hulda Klager became known as a hybridizer, which is somebody who develops new strains of a particular plant. She did it using Luther Burbank's model. She would get up early in the morning, and she would check to see when the lilacs were at just the right stage for pollinizing. Then she would use a toothbrush and she would brush the pollen from one plant and cross it with another plant, put it on another plant. And then she would take a small paper bag and put it over the area, the work area, and tie a string around it so that no insects could get in and fiddle with the work that she'd done. And then she would keep an eye on it to see what came of this. When she first started, she got so interested in what she was doing, she got a terrible sunburn because she quit paying attention to how long she'd been out in the sun. But she learned her lesson. She didn't do that again. But it took her quite a few years to really perfect this. At some point, she realized that she need not do quite so many steps. She eliminated the paper bags because of the time of day, and she was able to speed things up, that part of it up. But there was no speeding the lilacs up. Lilacs take sometimes as many as 7 years of growth before they produce a lilac. And so when she got the seeds, she planted the seeds, but that was just the beginning. She had a long wait before she found out if she had been successful in achieving what she was hoping to achieve, which was a better, more beautiful lilac. And she became very discouraged at some times. And one particular time that she was discouraged was the year that her husband died. And she became so discouraged that she was going to just throw out all the lilacs and give up. But her son, Fritz, insisted that she at least try this particular batch of lilacs. And so she did. And remarkably, from that particular batch comes some of her most beautiful lilacs.
As the story goes, in the history of Woodland, it was somewhere around the early 1900s that after an illness, someone had given Hulda a book by Luther Burbank, who was a noted horticulturist. And anyway, she decided that after reading the book, she would try to develop a better apple. That's where she started, and she liked to make her apple pies, but she did not like peeling the smaller apples, so she first started to grow a larger apple. Later years, and she did turn to the lilacs and the cultivating of those. She did go down to California and visit with Luther Burbank. They talked. She was internationally recognized for her work with the lilac.
Hulda was interested in creating a more beautiful lilac. She also wanted a lilac that had a better scent. She looked to sometimes produce single blossoms, which is four-petaled blossoms. And she also was very interested in getting more petals, and they're called doubles, and they go 8 or 16 or whatever, you know, she's whatever number. We have some that we call triples, but they have as many as 32 petals on them, and they look almost like purple popcorn when you see them. She was also interested in the size of the blossom, and so she crossed plants to get a larger floret on her lilac. She also worked to get a more beautiful color. One of the, well, and all of her colors are gorgeous, but one of the colors that we appreciate the most is the one that she named after her husband, Frank. It's a deep, dark purple, and it's one that everybody wants when they see it. The others are, she had a pink lilac, beautiful pink lilac. It was a single, but the blossoms were huge, and it's a beautiful, healthy lilac. She named that for Elizabeth, her oldest child. She also named lilacs for her other children as well. We have appreciation for those because we know that she probably picked the very best lilacs to name after her children. She also has a lilac that she called My Favorite because it was her favorite lilac. One way we can find out how many lilacs she developed is by the International Lilac Society's Register of Lilacs. Hulda's name is on 106 lilacs in the register. Many of those lilacs, in fact, a great majority of those lilacs, we have never seen. They have somehow either been lost in the flood or gone by the wayside through the years. Hulda Klager's process of hybridization really illustrates how patient she was. She had so much patience. She estimated that her success rate with the hybridization was 1 in 400 plants. And when you realize that she had to wait 7 years to find out if she was successful, it really gives you an idea of what she was like.
Just amazing how she came back time and time again and continued with her propagation, which was a long, slow process, sometimes lasting 7 years before she got the plant that she was trying for.
Frank, her husband, could not believe how many plants she would tell him to throw over the fence because they weren't good enough to keep. And Frank felt that maybe she was being too extreme, and so he took them and put them in the wheelbarrow and wheeled them out by the road and put free lilacs on the sign, and they would come by, people came by and would stop and be so thrilled that they were getting a plant from Hulda. And I think she had no idea how many plants they got that she didn't think were good enough, that I'm sure they still brag that they have one of Hulda's lilacs.
I did not know her personally, but looking at the pictures, and she had a very strong sense of direction in what she wanted to do with her lilacs. The amount of time it took to develop them. Sometimes she would spend 7 years on a particular variety, and if it did not turn out like she liked, she would throw it away. She had to have a strong character to survive the family tragedies as well as the many floods of the Lewis River Valley area and the what it did to her home and her yard. Other than that, I think she was probably a very well-loved person. Feelings of that generation were not as obvious as they are today.
Mrs. Klager was we called her Grandma Klager most of the time, of course. She was a hard-working, stern, but very nice woman that had to took care of a family and a husband, and in the olden times when there weren't all the conveniences. But she also was very interested in growing things, and she started to produce lilacs, which is takes a long time to do it, and it's 7 years from the time that you pollinize the seeds. And she just learned through reading from a book how it was kind of done. And the first lilac she got, they tell me she didn't keep hardly any of them, but she had to wait 7 years before she saw those flowers bloom.
We have on display at the Lilac Gardens magazines that wrote articles on Hulda. The first one was the American magazine of July of 1927. This article tells how there were crowds of cars, up to 400 on a given day. We have another article here, the Better Homes and Gardens magazine of October 1928, and the title, "It is Always Lilac Time in This Garden." Hulda worked on her lilacs year-round, and those labors were greatly appreciated and written about. This is the article in the Lewis River News that tells about the open house of May of 1928. There have been others since then on the gardens, telling of her great accomplishments.
There are other obstacles in her life that she had to overcome. Of course, was the flood. That was the big one, and that one really became well known in the area because she was a well-known hybridizer by that time, known as the Lilac Lady, and the newspapers came to interview her when that happened. We have pictures that show the absolute devastation on her face when that happened. But we also know that after 2 years, with the help from her friends, she was able to open her doors once again for the Lilac Week. And visitors came, like within that 2-year period, were able to come and start selecting lilacs again. Hulda was born in Germany. She was one of 6 children in the family, and at 2 years of age they moved to the United States. We believe that she came in, like so many immigrants, came in New York through Ellis Island, and they moved to Wisconsin. Her father was a beer brewer by trade, and so he got jobs in that line in Wisconsin. But those jobs were hard to come by, and he had a longing to own his own land, and so he moved his whole family to a little place called Pekin Landing, and it was not even a town at that point. And Woodland was not a town at all, but they moved to Pekin. Unfortunately, his wife was so worried about the many horrible stories of Indians that she had heard, untrue, by the way, but she was so worried about it that he had to turn around and go back to Wisconsin for a year. But still he couldn't get work, and so he decided to move the family back out. I think he probably convinced his wife that the Indians were not so bad, and he arrived with his family, and they bought a portion of a land grant near what would eventually become Woodland. She was about 13 years old at the time that she moved here, and she and her siblings were schooled in a tiny one-room schoolhouse, which is kind of remarkable when you realize that without the benefit of college, she was to become a famous scientist in that she hybridized all of these new varieties of lilacs. She was married, we think probably around the age of 16, which was pretty common for that time. She married a boy who was also from Germany. He was about 10 years older than she was, and they started out living with her parents on the farm. And then, after a couple of their children were born, they moved to the old 1889 farmhouse that we now have to show the public. The other two children were born at the house on Pekin Road, and I think all four children were born at the time that she began to work on the lilacs. She lived to be 97 years old, and she outlived all four of her children.
I'm Betty Mills, and my husband was a grandson of Hulda Klager, and my mother-in-law, Hulda's oldest daughter, was my mother-in-law. I got to visit the garden as a family, and when we came here for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and Mrs. Klager helped put on the dinner. But at that time, she was in her 80s and early 90s too, so the family all pitched in, and I remember she liked to make, she always made the coleslaw, and it had a dressing in it that I don't know quite what she did, but she was a good cook and a very good seamstress.
We've recently restored our history room to contain memorabilia from the life of Hulda Klager and her family in this community. We have, first of all, a house picture here. The house was built in 1889 by her father, Gottfried Thiel, and they lived in the house until their passing, and then Hulda and her husband Frank then moved into the house. And you can notice at that two pictures that the later picture, they've put a foundation under it to protect it from the incoming waters. And then we have another picture over here. Of Hulda and her husband Frank. This picture was taken about 1920 out in their front yard, and you can see the lilac trees. Here's Nippy again. And then we're going to go up here to 1927 to 1932 and see the foliage in front of the house. Here's Hulda. Display case up here is their son Fritz. Fritz and his mother pretty well ran the dairy farm, and he was with her during the flood and helped to return the house to what it is today. When Hulda's son Fritz passed in 1948, her granddaughter Irvina was married to Mac Van Eaton. They lived in Kelso, and they came down and moved into the house with Hulda.
One of the things that makes Hulda so remarkable is her spirit. She had such a spirit about her. And you look at the tragedies that happened during her life and the things that she overcame, you can't help but admire what a wonderful woman she was.
When Grandma died, she had willed the place to her son-in-law, Mac Van Eaton, and so it became his house, and he was taking care of it and everything. And then after a few years, he decided he couldn't do it anymore, so he put it up for sale. And no one got too excited about that at that time. But when Mac decided to sell it, he sold it to a developer, and all of a sudden they decided they were going to tear the house down and level all the trees and all the shrubs that were growing. And then the women got upset because they said, my gosh, we can't lose that. But the men didn't see what, after all, we needed to have new business in town, so they would just tear all the garden down and put in some manufacturing. But the ladies decided they wanted to try to save it, and the men thought there was no way that women could run it, and how could they keep it going. But they got some help from different people, and they saved the garden from being destroyed, which now we're so glad that they did. But it was a hard-working bunch of women that made the money and got the garden saved.
In today's society, we are so used to instant gratification that it's amazing to me that you would be able to hold your interest in a hobby that takes 7 years before you can actually find out if it's really good or not. And she was really amazing in that way.
And I'm so happy that I was married into the family, and as a grown-up, I've been able to come and help continue the work in the garden. We've got to remember that women, and even 150 years ago, were interested in creating things like this, and I'm just delighted to know that this film has been taken so that it can be put as history to the wonderful life and the work that Mrs. Klager did here at this gardens.